Welcome back to the channel. My name's Sarah Kate, and this is the continuation of the series, What is the Bible? Last week, we started talking about the Old and New Testament canon. So if you missed the video last week, check out that video in the channel page. This week, we're going to continue with that discussion of the canon, how the Old Testament canon and the New Testament canon were created. And then, like I've said in the previous videos, after we talk about this, we're going to move forward from how we got the Hebrew, the original collection of the Bible, these canons that were just put together, moving forward into how we got to the, let's say, NIV translation or the King James Version translation. So let's jump in with the Old Testament canon. The Old Testament is made up of 39 books of the Bible. So how did these 39 books get compiled and when? We don't know exactly when the Old Testament was first put together in its canonical form, but it was probably several centuries before Jesus was born. Although then it wasn't called the Old Testament, but they were referred to as the Scriptures. The earliest form of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was actually arranged differently than our Bible is arranged today. And I'm going to show you guys the differences probably in this area here so we can visualize the order difference. The Hebrew Bible was arranged into three parts. The first part of the Hebrew Bible was the law, and this was the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the Hebrew name for this section, the law, the first part, is the Torah. Then the second part of the Hebrew Bible was the prophets. This is Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets following those. And the Hebrew name for this section of the Bible was Nebim. I'm going to put that there just in case I'm saying that wrong. And then there's the third section. And the third section of the Hebrew Bible was the writings. This is Ruth, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra through Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And the Hebrew name for this third section is Ketubim. So if you take Torah, Nebim, and Ketubim, that is T and K, and they took the first letter of each of those words, T and K, and they created the word Tanakh. And that is the name of the original Hebrew Bible. Then, after the Hebrew Bible creation, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was created, and we talked about this last week. This Greek translation is called the Septuagint, and the Septuagint changed the order of the books. This happened around 250 BC. This order, the order changed from Hebrew to Greek, is the order of our current Bible today of the Old Testament. We've talked about this before, but the order of the Old Testament, we've got the first section, which is the historical books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. We have the second section, which is the poetic books, Job through Song of Songs. And then we have the third section, which is the prophetic books, Isaiah through Malachi. Following the Septuagint, so Septuagint is the Greek translation of Hebrew. Then came the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation. The Latin Bible translation did use the Hebrew as translation, but they used the Greek Bible to set the order. So following the Septuagint, the order of the Old Testament remains the same. People continue to use that order as they continue to translate into different languages. Interestingly, though, the Hebrew Bible also remains the same. The order of the Hebrew Bible, if you've seen one, is still the same as it was at its original creation. Following the Latin Bible, Protestant churches translated from the Hebrew Bible but used the Septuagint to order the books. So that's the basic of the Old Testament canon. Now let's talk about the New Testament canon. There is evidence that the New Testament canon began to be compiled during the lives of the apostles, and the composition of the New Testament canon, the collections of the writings, was under the supervision of the people who were writing these books at that time. And here's a couple of examples from Scripture that talk about saving the works and compiling the works together in canonical form. So this is from Colossians 4, chapter 4, verse 16. It says, after this is from Paul, after this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church, meaning save it, guard it, continue to read it elsewhere. Paul also says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 27, I charge you before the Lord to have this letter read to all the brothers and sisters. And then this is an example from Peter. This is in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 15. And I will make every effort to see that after my departure, you will be able to remember these things. Meaning, I'm going to write this down. I'm going to keep track of it. So keep it, continue to read it, put it together with other letters and collection, and use this as part of the canon. That was their idea, and that was their hope for these letters. Let's talk about where some of the first New Testament books started to appear. What was the geographical location of these books, or the letters? Where were they coming from? So we know that Matthew, James, and maybe Hebrew came from Palestine. We know that John, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation came from Asia Minor. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Luke maybe came from Greece. The book Titus came from Crete. And the book Mark, Acts, and Romans came from Rome, the Roman area. So as you can see from these maps, pretty large variation in area, kind of spread out all over the place when these letters were being written and compiled. Since the creation of these letters ranged from all over the Middle East, and because during this time period many churches had to hide under Emperor Nero, which is around AD 64, the variations of the New Testament canon were actually pretty different by region. So maybe Asia Minor had letters that were created there and Rome didn't have those letters, or vice versa. Because all the collections were pretty different by region, there started to become a criteria of how do we know what should be collected together as part of the canon. And the criteria became this. 1, was this work written by an apostle? Or 2, was this work written under the direction of an apostle, or in connection to an apostle? For instance, Mark's gospel, which is based on the preaching of Peter. This is what the beginning section of my Mark. Okay, maybe you have a little beginning section in yours too. Mine says this: most Bible scholars are convinced that Mark was the earliest gospel written, and that it served as one of the sources for the writing of Matthew and Luke. The Gospel of Mark is anonymous. Although the author is believed to be John Mark was the son of a widow named Mary, in whose the house the church in Jerusalem sometimes gathered. You can find that story in Acts 12, and where Jesus probably ate the Last Supper with his disciples. According to the early church fathers, Mark wrote his gospel in Rome either just before or after Peter's martyrdom. And elsewhere you can find evidence that Mark is using Peter's preaching to inform his gospel. Last week we mentioned the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is not something that in general most of us have read or know a lot about. But around this time, during the collection of these letters, the writing of these letters, when apostles were beginning this process, there were a lot of people writing things that weren't necessarily true, for whatever reason. So the question came about in the assembly of the New Testament: how do we know, how can we prove these writings are true? And early on, one way to show the validity of the New Testament books was through other authoritative writings by other Christians around the same exact time. So for example, Polycarp, this is Polycarp, he did these things, quotes Philippians in a letter to the Philippians and calls up other phrases from Paul when he in other parts of his writings. Ignatius, this is Ignatius. These are the things he did. Ignatius quotes from Matthew and other books in the New Testament. So these popular authors during this time period also mention these writings that created some more validity in the letters and the text they were referring to. Last video, we talked about this really cool guy called Sir Henry Rawlinson, who really was a tipping point for translation in the Old Testament and translation in general. And this week, we're going to talk about another really fun guy, and his name is Eusebius. This is Eusebius. He's a really interesting guy. Use Wikipedia, look up Eusebius. He was the bishop of Caesarea, and he was also the first great church historian. During his lifetime, he gathered together letters. He was taking copious notes of what people were doing in the area and how the early church was formed. If you're thinking about the early church, Eusebius wrote it down, and he started making notes. Eusebius lived under and during the time of the direct persecution of Christians. We're going to talk a little bit about the Diocletian persecution for a second. So, under the Diocletian persecution, Christians were, their legal rights were taken away. They were discriminated against. They were forced to sacrifice to gods. They were imprisoned. They were executed. So just because Jesus came and died to save all of humanity doesn't mean everybody was automatically on board with Christianity. We know that there was a lot of trouble with Christianity throughout history. But we're talking about early Christianity, the early years, as the church was beginning to be formed. There was intense persecution of Christians by Roman officials. There's an interesting picture on the Wikipedia page for Diocletian persecution. It's known as the last great persecution of Christians, where a lion is about to eat or attack a bunch of Christians. I mean, this kind of martyrdom and imprisonment and sacrifice by Christians was really intense during this time. It started out around the 200s, 200 BC, not really being too bad. Christians who were found to be Christians were asked to make sacrifices to the lowercase g gods, Roman gods. In some cases, if they said that they did it, they got off. But as time moved on, the persecution became greater and greater. Some Roman emperors were really insistent about the persecution, some were not. Diocletian was Emperor Diocletian was very insistent about persecution. Emperor Diocletian in the 300s started burning down churches, started burning sacred texts, started burning Christians alive, forcing priests to make sacrifices to gods or be jailed or killed. any places of worship, any scripture, anything that could be considered Christian was absolutely against the Roman Empire and, according to them, needed to be destroyed. Early 300s, Emperor Constantine comes around. And Emperor Constantine did not care that Christians wanted to be Christians. He accepted Christianity, and he wanted to make himself seem like the liberator of Christians. So Emperor Constantine decided to fully endorse Christianity. And as one of his endorsements, he found Eusebius, and Eusebius became Constantine's chief religious advisor. The first order from Constantine was that Eusebius direct an effort to create 50 Bibles. Now, when we think about 50 Bibles, that doesn't seem that important, but these would be the first 50 Bibles on the planet completely compiled together, almost exactly as they are today. So, unfortunately, we don't have these 50 Bibles. How cool would it be if we still had these 50 Bibles? But we don't. But remember a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the Codex Sinaiticus, and we're going to get back to the Codex Sinaiticus, but the Codex Sinaiticus is possibly a surviving example of one of these 50 Bibles. We're taking into account here that 397 was the Council of Carthage. The Codex Sinaiticus was prior to that, and Eusebius was collecting these biblical texts prior to that also. So Eusebius is leading us into the Council of Carthage here. Next week, we're going to jump into translation. We're going to talk about how the Bible went from Hebrew to Aramaic to Greek to Latin and then to English. So it's going to be a really fun week. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe to our channel. If you don't have a YouTube account, consider making one, and hit the like button down there at the bottom of the video, because the more you support this video, the more videos come out, and the more you can see content like this. Thanks for being here on our journey through the Bible. Again, eventually we're going to actually move into the Bible right now, and then for the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to continue talking about its formation. Thanks for joining. Hope you enjoyed this video, and have a great week.